Made possible through support from ARC thrift stores, developmental pathways, Firefly Autism, and the Arc of Aurora. A THINK+change training.
Hello, everyone out there listening in to our latest THINK+change vodcast podcast. Offering today information around what are IEPs, what are 504s, what should you know as either a parent or an individual with a disability on how to kind of traverse the educational system. So as we've done in the past, this first episode is just a real kind of general overview of what to expect, what's out there, what's available. And then make sure you tune into the next one because we'll be talking more about like regular things that we run into as advocates in the community around issues that pop up around 504s and IEPs. So before we get too far, Petrie, can you tell us a little bit about what these things are? Demystify it for us.
Sure, absolutely. So an IEP stands for an Individualized Education Plan. And this is kind of a body of information, testing data, present levels of a student's achievement, and then all of their accommodations, modifications to their education if they have any of those, and their goals, which is kind of the primary piece also of the IEP, the goals that these students are working on, and then the way in which these goals not only will be achieved, but how they'll be measured. So that's kind of an IEP in a nutshell. The way that IEPs even came about, there is a federal piece of legislation called IDEA, which stands for an Individuals with Disabilities Educational Act. And this provides free and appropriate education to students with disabilities. IEPs, hence the I, the individualized, are supposed to be tailored to that student's specific needs. So it's really tight, specific document, like I said, tailored to the student's needs to help them not only navigate, but access their education throughout their schooling.
Cool. So you said that it was federal. So if I lived in Iowa and I'm now moving to Colorado, would my IEP travel with me?
It does travel with you. It will go state to state, school to school. Now, sometimes each new school or new state will have to assess the IEP that it's receiving to make they can provide all of those same supports and services. But if they can't provide something that's specific to the IEP, they still are required to provide something, very similar so that the student is still receiving the supports that they need. So even if it looks a little bit different, in general, the IEP stays intact and will follow the student.
Okay, cool. And so like if I got an IEP when I was in first grade, are those goals the same for the rest of my life, or do
that's what's kind of nice. Yeah,
oh, okay.
That's right. So as students achieve their goals, then they've hit that kind of milestone. So then they'll be tasked with new goals in hopes of progression. Now, sometimes a goal isn't necessarily met, and within that, attack to try and reach that goal, information can be divulged that maybe this isn't the appropriate goal, or maybe the way we're trying to get this student to meet that goal isn't appropriate. And so things can be tweaked along the way. But the hope and the goal of the IEP is to, help them progress throughout their school career. So goals are often changed, from grade to grade, sometimes with even within the same year. Sometimes goals are, pretty aggressive. And so maybe it takes a little bit longer even than a school year. But the team decides, where the progression is, how it's going, and, what's next in terms of making goals.
Cool. And does that team meet like every year?
Yeah, every year they have called an annual review. However, if the team or even the parent, even the student, if they feel as though something in the IEP needs to change, be modified, or even have additions to the IEP, the team can meet at any time to revise the IEP if needed. And then every 3 years, a student is reevaluated just to kind of see where they are and to see if there needs to be any kind of fundamental shifts in the IEP itself.
Perfect. Thank you, Petrie. Jeff, what do you know about a 504? Like, what is it?
It's similar to an IEP, but I would call it an IEP junior. A 504 is a plan for a child to access learning in school. And it could be any child with a disability, but the disability needs to impact them somehow from accessing general education materials. It doesn't have to be such a significant disability as IEPs sometimes house. We could be looking at just ADHD or anxiety. There's a lot of things that qualify you for a 504, including some medical diagnoses. The plan is mostly made out of accommodations and some supports for the child, but once again, just based on accessing the learning. Unlike an IEP, there's no goals involved and no service times typically involved. And a 504 is ran by the 504 coordinator. And if you're not sure who that is in your school, just ask. Sometimes it's the school nurse, sometimes it's a principal. So just, once again, ask if you're not sure. The 504 also has fewer rights and safeguards as an IEP, but it still is backed by federal law. In fact, it's supported based on the Rehabilitation Act of 1974. So it is supported by a federal civil rights law, and it's basically was created to stop discrimination in the educational setting for students. And once again, this blueprint for the 504, what the plan is housed within the section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973.
Cool. So both an IEP and a 504 are really governed and built into federal law. And so, it sounds like both services or both support documents, right? Travel with an individual as long as they need it. I did a little bit of research before we hopped on here today, and I thought it was super interesting because, a 504 can be built for an individual that doesn't necessarily need access to like special education services, right? So like that 504 is really in place for kiddos that can access like your general education. And for those of you listening, I'm air quoting like general education, right? But they need some accommodations to maybe do so. So like preferential seating in a classroom or extended time to take tests, or maybe even like audiovisual equipment. But otherwise they're making the typical progress that you would like to see from children. So don't need specific goals. They just need to make sure that that environment supports their learning needs.
And it can also be something as simple as access to a snack. But what else I was gonna say, you can also have a 504 along with an IEP. You can actually have both.
Totally.
And oftentimes, if your child doesn't qualify for an IEP, but you still feel there's a need for some of the accommodations, then you can look into, creating a 504 plan. But unlike the IEP, there's not a reevaluation every 3 years or anything like that. In fact, there's not really a law that says it has to be even reviewed annually, but typically it is. And I would recommend any family reviews it every year with the team because things change.
Absolutely.
Needs of the students change.
And I think it's also worth noting about the 504, there are times when those will transition off of an IEP. They no longer need IEP, but they still do need some, support. And so they may transition off the IEP onto a 504.
Totally.
And that has happened before too.
Another juicy little tidbit. For childcare in a school, if it's a federally funded school, your 504 plan can be used for after or before school programming as well.
Very cool. Yeah, I've seen individuals, either they step off of an IEP into that 504, and some families are really surprised because they are totally different documents, right? Most
Right.
IEPs are like 14 plus pages long and describe the child in detail and describe all the services and then talk about goals and, pretty like
It's comprehensive.
conceptually tight documents, right? And then a 504 is often a couple pages long, and it just feels, it feels like such a different process. But what we know as advocates, that if children are able to access general education with appropriate accommodations, even though it's such a different system of services and supports and even the conversation around it, as long as a school environment has built in those accommodations, then they're going to continue to clip along with pace with their general ed peers.
Mhm.
I have seen, Jeff, you mentioned that you could have both an IEP and a 504. And some of the best examples of having, maybe needing, another air quote, needing both documents was like for an individual in a high school setting that really wanted to participate with like the track and field team and was able to and have the skills and the physical aptitude to do it, but also needed some special accommodations to be able to do it. So while obviously an IEP is intended for a school-based environment, they're not going to build goals around like how fast Phil could run, but they could build in this 504 that helped make sure he had like a running buddy, so that he understood the situation and expectations of either that environment or like the track meet. So those are really good examples of if a 504 or if an IEP does not follow outside of that classroom environment, but accommodations are needed to access the things that all of your peers would be. That's another place to look at how you can build in those supports too.
Mhm. Yeah.
So who knows, so we talked a little bit about like elementary and high school, but what about the transitions? Knowing that kids with special needs, if it makes sense, could continue on with what they call transition services, which is that 18 to 21, usually pretty focused on like, life skills and independent living. Petrie, do you know a little bit about if, transition services also have access to these?
Yeah, and they do. And
Both?
yeah, both.
Okay, cool.
They can do both the IEP and the 504. I mean, while the transition period is primarily focused on life skills, they're still in a school setting and they do take those skills out into the world. But there's still, a lot of that takes place in the classroom. And so therefore, the IEP, the 504, both will follow them into that environment.
Cool. So on that same vein of classroom settings, what about like post-secondary, like junior colleges or four-year colleges or even like trade schools?
Yeah, so unfortunately, IEP and 504 services end after high school.
Mhm.
However, post-secondary, higher ed, trade schools must provide accommodations to remove unfair barriers to learning or physical access to learning. And this is also comes up in section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. But it doesn't mean it's a 504 plan, but that act still supports people getting accommodations in these settings. It's not, but the biggest difference too is it's not up to these schools or programs to identify your disability. The student must notify the school of their disability if they want the accommodations, because they're not going to know you need them if you don't tell them. So I suggest a student seeks out the student disability office or the ADA coordinator. There's going to be one or the other or both in any school. And what they're going to do, they might ask for a copy of your IEP or 504 just to review it to see what accommodations you've had that you've been successful with and what they have to offer.
Sure.
But they don't necessarily have to do that, but that's a pretty good practice and fairly common.
Totally.
And then you create your accommodations, but it's really at that point, you got to take control. And if you're having trouble though taking control, you can always get an ARC advocate and we can help you access that disability office and have the conversations you need to have.
Totally. Well, and even still, I mean, that it's a really good reminder that once an individual transitions out of kind of these, like the school district settings, right, that the onus is on now that individual to
Right.
self-report that you have a disability to get the accommodations you need. You know, even in employment situations or when you're doing independent living and you need some special housing access, you know, folks under that 504 Rehabilitation Act are required to provide, and the ADA, of course, are required to provide reasonable accommodations, but they're not required to ask you if you need reasonable accommodations, right? And so to avoid both disability discrimination and also just to get what you need in those environments, having the opportunity to communicate in advance with what you need to make sure that A, that setting can provide it, and B, that they're able to make those, you know, adjustments with you as you either learn about the housing environment or about the job or further tasks and techniques. That while you won't have like a plan or a team to help develop that with you, the goal is through that early education is to learn what accommodations make the most sense for you, so that as you age into adulthood, you'll know what some really clear things are that are best practice for you in the way you traverse the community. So it makes sense. I mean,
Yeah.
and it's kind of cool. It's kind of like the next iteration of self-advocacy, right? You know, you spend maybe 21 years working on who you are and what you need, right? And then you get to apply them out in the adult world.
Which is why I'm a huge fan of self-advocacy goals in IEPs, especially in that transition period, because you need those the rest of your life.
Totally. Well, you guys, I feel like we did a pretty good job of a general overview of what is an IEP and what is a 504. And while for all you listeners or viewers, we've perhaps oversimplified it because they are huge, intense documents governed by federal law that no 15-minute fodder podcast could cover. So what we're going to do in the next episode is to talk a little bit about just regular challenges that at us as advocates, we support families in navigating with both the IEP and 504 process, in hopes, again, that we're all doing our own self-advocacy to resolve the issues that pop up as they arise. So thanks for joining us, listening to us, or watching us wherever you are in the internet world. Tune in for episode 2.
THINK+change. Talks, trainings, and tools to help in your work for or with people with intellectual and other developmental disabilities. Learn more at www.thinkchange.training.